We are back in First Peter. Were you able to? They're still working on this PowerPoint. It feels like we've been on a vacation from First Peter. It's been a few weeks since we've been there, but it feels kind of like coming back to an old friend, doesn't it? We've been with him for so long. We are 60% done with the book. 2 chapters to go. So by the time we finish, it will be warm. So you can look forward to that. That will be good. So we're at the beginning of chapter 4 now. So 1 Peter chapter 4. And we're going to be looking at the first 3 verses this morning. So let me start by reading that. 1 Peter 4, verses 1 through 3. Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose. Because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh no longer for the lust of men, but for the will of God. For the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lusts, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. And so there is where we will end for today. So this one I've titled Leaving Our Past Reality and Loving Our Present Requirement. I couldn't help the alliteration. Leaving our past reality and loving our present requirement. So I want to show you a couple things if I can, but I may not be able to right now. I want you to think about some of the images and things that you see in our world and our culture. We're kind of bombarded with them to the point that we don't always necessarily think about it. So think about advertisements that you've seen. Think about the kind of things or images that are used to try and sell us things. So most of those images, if you think about them, I'm going to broadly lump them in 2, but maybe a 3rd category. One is sex or sexual images, and there are studies that show it doesn't matter what you're selling. You could be selling like a business product, and they will use sexual images to try and sell a business product. Has nothing to do with the actual product. But we run into that. Another category would be, I would say, alcohol in general. Now we'll keep that a separate product category. So you think of how many different advertisements you see that are like beer commercials, drinking related commercials. So, thank you. You'll see them just everywhere. And so now I will show you some of them. This is one phrase that my family makes fun of all the time. The concept of follow your heart. So sometimes I just pulled this off of an image. Sometimes you have to follow your heart no matter the consequences. Now these are things that are like on sweatshirts and coffee mugs and whatnot. And if you think about now, a lot of times it just says follow your heart because that's a cooler, pithier saying. But really, what it's saying is like I like this one because it's like no matter the consequences. So think about that. Is that really a good idea, to follow our heart, no matter the consequences? Jeremiah says our heart is deceitful and wicked beyond all else. Is that the kind of thing you want to follow in God? But these are the sort of things that come our way all the time. Here's another one. Whatever you want to do it now. There are only so many tomorrows. Again, what are these messages telling us? Live for it now. Don't worry about the consequences. Don't worry about whether something is right or true or noble or good. But just, do you want to do it? Does it feel good? Would it make you happy right here and right now? These are the kind of messages that come to our mind. Now, why am I bringing these up? All of these are talking about what I think Peter was talking about in verse 3 about this past reality. Now, it's supposed to be our past reality. This is supposed to be our lives before Christ. But the reality is that we are surrounded by these images and these messages. And even after we've accepted Christ, we have to be careful that what's supposed to be our past reality doesn't creep into our present reality. So these are kind of messages. So if I get another click, can I get a click? I cannot get a click. Can you advance me for one more? Otherwise, that image is going to burn in your mind, and you're going to think this is what my message is all about. It'd be really drastic. Here it is. I talked about, I don't know if you can see that, but this is a research. This is from Cornell University. On average, the researchers estimated, here it is again, that survey respondents were exposed to 576 alcohol ads over the previous year. And I actually almost feel like that's a low number. But think about it, 576 ads over the year. Does that start to influence the way you think? And again, we live in Wisconsin, so I'm sure it's higher in our state. And this one I decided not to put up an image because it would be bad. But Business News Daily, we're looking at sexual imagery. So researchers looked at 3,232 full-page ads. There's a job for you. Published from 10 years apart, 83, 93, and 2003. And those are, and then, add 20 more years, that's where we are today. In the popular magazines, they looked at Cosmopolitan, Redbook, Esquire, Playboy, and Newsweek, and Time. I wonder who volunteered for which magazines. I don't know. But they found sexual imagery in 20% of the ads overall. And that the use of sex was used to sell everything from alcohol to banking services. And that year after year, or decade after decade, as they studied, it continually increased. So just think about that. We're 20 years past that now. So is that 20% higher or lower? It's going to be higher. So these are the things, the images that are sent to us and sent our way. So here we have our past reality. In verse 3, Peter said, listen, you have the time already passed is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles. So you think of the Gentiles, just think of, as Peter's using that phrase, he's talking about all of the world around us, the way that everybody around us lives, but we're supposed to be living different. That's what he's talking about. So we've carried out the desire of the Gentiles, of the world around us. That's why I wanted to give you a snapshot of the world around us. Thinking about carrying out that desire. So here's a sort of a definition from it of carrying out the desire of the Gentiles. The disgraceful actions that we perpetrate is a result of doing what we want to do. We just want to do what we want to do, and what results is disgraceful actions. That's what happens when we carry out the desire of the Gentiles. Okay? So that's that concept of like following our own desires, following our own heart. Now I want to be clear here that as believers in Christ, that God can give us desires, and God can give us a new heart, and we can seek after those desires, and that can be a good and godly thing. But it's really, we have to be very careful because it's really hard to separate our desires and God's desires. And it takes a lot of prayer, a lot of discernment. I would say it takes a lot of counsel. You should be seeking other people to say, am I doing this because I want to, or because God wants me to do that? So I want to give you, I don't have these on the screen, so you have to follow along with me if you will. A couple of verses that talks about what happens when we follow the desires of, I'll just say the world around us, or as Peter said, the Gentiles. Okay, what does this desire look like? So first go to Romans 1:27. I'm just going to give you a few of these verses here. So Romans 1, verse 27. He's talking, I always talk about Romans 1 as like the great exchange. So in the great exchange, we see, it's actually not a great exchange, it's the terrible exchange, where God sort of gives up on humanity and says, fine, you want to do what you want to do? Go ahead and do what you want to do. So that's in the middle of this. And then verse 27 says, in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another. So there's the desire. Men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of the error. So in other words, here's a desire, and instead they pursue their own desires, and where does it lead? It leads to something that God did not intend. Now go to the next chapter, Romans 2, verse 9. It says, there will be tribulation and distress for every soul of men who does evil, of the Jew first and also of the Greek. So they do evil because they desire evil. So the desire leads to this action. And where does it lead? It says tribulation and distress for every soul. This is the natural consequences of carrying out the desire of the Gentiles. Peter said, we've done that. This is the way we used to live. Now go to 1 Corinthians 5, verses 2 and 3. 1 Corinthians 5, 2 and 3 says, you have become arrogant and have not mourned instead. I really should start at verse 1, sorry. Okay, start at verse 1. 1 Corinthians 5. It is actually reported that there is immorality among you, and immorality of such a kind as does not exist even among the Gentiles. Again, even among the world. The world's doing all this terrible stuff, and you're doing something that they don't even think is cool. It says someone has his father's wife. And how do they respond? It says, you've become arrogant and have not mourned instead, so that the one who had done this deed would be removed from your midst. I, on my part, though absent in your body, but present in spirit, have already judged him who has so committed this, as though I were present. So again, here we see, here's a desire. I want this woman. You're not supposed to have her. I don't care. I want her. And instead of dealing with it and saying, that is not what God wants, the church was not reacting the right way. That's what Paul was responding to. But what I want you to see here is the sense of there's this desire. We care about the desire of the Gentiles. If we do the desire of what the world wants us to do, this is where it leads. This is the natural implications of where it leads to. And it is a multi-million, probably billion-dollar industry literally trying to get us to follow our own desires. So this is not neutral ground we're on. I just want you to recognize that when I'm trying to get to think about like the different ads and things. These desires, we're actually encouraged to follow them. And so if we're not careful, we're just going to simply fall back into the past. This is our past reality. This is what life is supposed to be like before Christ, not with Christ. And so there should be a distinction that our life should look different. And so part of that, Peter said, and this is back in 1 Peter 4, verse 3, he said, we pursued these things, and then he has the list. And we'll go over that list a little bit. But before we do, what did he says when we pursued, that word pursue is interesting in itself. What does it mean to pursue after these things? The biblical definition of that is to lead or order one's life, or to a thing of which one's life is given up. So now there's this list, right, of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, abominable idolatries. These are the things that we've pursued. We've gone after them. My life is ordered in such a way that this is the most important thing in my life. That's what he's saying. We've pursued that. Now, where else? I want to again show you. These are closer to 1 Peter as far as flipping pages. Some other places that talks about what happens when we pursue these things more than anything else. So if you go to 2 Peter 3, verse 3, Peter, again, in a different letter, is saying this, know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts. They're pursuing the things they want to pursue. Then go to the often forgot book of Jude, right before Revelation, one little chapter. Jude 1:16 says, these people are grumblers, finding fault, following after their own lusts. It's the same word in Greek. They're pursuing their own lusts. They speak arrogantly. They flatter people for the sake of gaining an advantage. And then go down just another verse, verse 18. They were saying to you, in the last time there will be mockers, following after their own ungodly lusts. They're pursuing the wrong things. That's what's happening. They're imitating the wrong things. So what are the things that Peter says? Okay, this is our past reality. What were the things that before Christ we were pursuing? Now, there's a list. I'm going to take them one at a time. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on each of them, but it's kind of important to know a little bit what he's talking about. Sensuality is the first thing on the list. We pursued sensuality. Now, when I looked up the biblical definition, it gave me a whole bunch of words. Oops, there they all are. And I'm like, what do all those mean? So this is all just defining sensuality, just the first word. So one is unbridled lust, or uncontrolled sexual passion. Again, where do we see that in our culture? Yes. Another definition of sensuality is excess, wanting something more than is necessary or is permissible. Do we see that in our culture? Oh, I have this, but I want this. This is okay, but I want this to be okay. We just keep pushing the envelope, the sense of excess. Licentiousness is a throwing off of sexual restraints. Whatever you want to do sexually, you can do. Does that sound like our culture? Lasciviousness. I love that word. Lasciviousness. Filled with or showing sexual desire. These are all words that are helping to describe sensuality. Wantonness is mercilessness, or having no just foundation. Being without check or limitation. Again, here's what I want. Don't put limits on me. Don't give me boundaries. I want to do whatever I want to do. Wantonness. Outrageousness. Grossly offensive to what is right or decent. Do we even have a definition of what is right or decent? These are, again, I'm not trying to paint an overly harsh picture. I'm just saying when I read this, I think like Peter is very relevant to America today. That's what I see. Shamelessness. Having no painful feelings of humiliation or distress. You don't ever feel shame. There is no sense, your conscience has been hardened and it no longer works. And the last one on the list is insolence, being rude or disrespectful. All of those things. So that's just one word. Don't worry, they're not all that long. But sensuality. Those are the things that we've pursued. Sensuality. Lusts. These are some words that go along with lust. Desire, craving, longing. I'm thinking if I was more like a tech-savvy cool guy, I would throw up little commercial clips that use these words. Longing for Doritos or whatever, right? I have a craving for this brand of beer because it has less calories. Or the desire is a strong feeling. I gotta have this. I need to have it. And again, we're promoted to think this way. We're encouraged to think this way. And so we have to be aware. We're not on neutral territory. There. Drunkenness, I don't think I need to explain this one because, again, we live in Wisconsin. We know what that means. Carousing, I thought was interesting. The concept of carousing, I've used that word before, but it comes from the Greek writings. It's literally a nocturnal and riotous procession of half-drunken and frolicsome fellows who, after supper, paraded through the streets with torches and music in honor of Bacchus, who is the Roman name for Dionysus. Bacchus is the god of fertility, god of wine, god of pleasure, god of ecstasy. So I think if our culture had a god, it probably would be Bacchus. The carousing, and then they would go and just create. They have feasts, drinking parties until late at night, and indulge in revelry. Could look up what that means, but that's another message. So the whole concept of carousing, right? And for some reason, Peter saw fit that drinking parties was a different. To me, I read that what carousing was. It sounded like a big drinking party, but he also added drinking parties as a separate list. Again, we live in Wisconsin. I don't need to define that one for you. And then idolatries, but not just idolatries, but abominable idolatries. So this is talking about anything that comes out of idolatry. So again, does our culture have a god? It might be the god of Bacchus. Anything that comes from, when we put idolatry is simply anything we put above God. Anything we put above God, and then the results of that, that's what it's talking about, abominable idolatries. And abominable means, they're lawless. They're contrary to the law. They're contrary, if I could say it in this way, it's contrary to a well-ordered, a well-lived Christian life. We're not following the right God. And the consequences show themselves. So, again, this is our past reality. This is what it's supposed to be. The reason I say supposed to is that I know if we're honest with ourselves that there are places in our lives that we see these things. Because, again, our culture is bombarded by them. And there's just places where we didn't even realize, like, oh, yep, no, I've given into that, or I've thought about that, or I've desired that when I shouldn't have. But if I look at that whole long list, my summary for this, and you can disagree if you want with me, but it really seems like it comes down to those three things. There's a lot of sexual content in the list. There's a lot of drinking, and I would include drugs into that as well. So you're trying to alter the way your body feels, whether that's drinking or drugs. And then pleasure, which probably covers both of them. But there's people pleasure seeking. We're trying to sell things through sex. through drinking. This is just the prevailing messages we're being given. And we have to be aware of them. We have to be aware of what that looks like. So this sounds, you can tell why I did these verses backwards. I started at verse 3, and now I'm moving up to verse 1 and 2, because this is a terrible way to end a message. This is not encouraging. But what does Peter have to say to us? What does God have to say to us through his word about all what we're bombarded by and what the culture around us is and what our past is supposed to be like? What he has to tell us is enough of it. It's in verse 2, it's in verse 3. He says, listen, you've lived your life in the flesh. So now, verse 2, live the rest of the time in the flesh no longer. You don't need to do that anymore. Look at verse 3. The time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out all these desires. Listen, before Christ, we live that way. I don't care if you came to Christ when you were 4 or 44 or 84. We've had plenty of time before Christ to live for ourselves, for our own desires. We don't need to do it anymore. It's enough. We've wasted enough time. We've pursued enough meaningless things that will never fill us. They'll just leave us emptier and emptier and emptier. We don't need to do that. We've lived for our own pleasures long enough. And if that's the case, where does that leave us? It leaves us to our present requirements. What does God ask us? If we're supposed to give all those things up, that's in the past. What's in the present? What's the reality today? The present requirement is really simply this in verse 1. Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves. Arm yourselves. That's the calling. It's actually the one command in this whole passage we're looking at is to arm yourselves. And what are we supposed to arm ourselves with? We see it with the same purpose or the same mindset of Christ. The same mentality that Christ had. That's how we're supposed to arm ourselves. And what was the mentality or the mindset or the purpose of Christ? It's that if you haven't learned this from Peter yet, you're going to learn it today. That Christ suffered in the flesh. This is the model he gave for us. This is the example he gave for us. Now let me show you this again. This is our review of 1 Peter so far. Look at where it says, Christ suffered in the flesh. This is our purpose. We're supposed to have the same purpose of Christ. He suffered in the flesh. Go back to chapter 2, verse 21. Why did Christ suffer in the flesh? You've been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you. Why? Leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps. He suffered in the flesh. Guess what? We have an example to follow. How did he do it? Go a couple verses down. Chapter 2, verse 23. When he was reviled, he didn't revile. When he suffered, he did not utter threats. But he trusted himself to him who judges righteously. We see that with Christ suffered in the flesh. How did he do it? He didn't retaliate. He trusted God to judge. He didn't take the matter into his own hands. So we're supposed to have that same mind, the same mentality. One more, chapter 3, verse 18. Why did Christ suffer in the flesh? It said he died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God. He suffered in the flesh so that we could have a relationship with God, so that we could be brought back into God's family. So we are called to arm ourselves with the same purpose of Christ. And that purpose then is by suffering in the flesh. Now, how does that happen? What does that look like? I'm going to put it into two categories. The first way that happens is through persecution. Peter was talking to his audience. This was a very real reality. That's why he kept talking so much about Christ's suffering and that example he had for us. Persecution is the time we suffer in the flesh when other people make us suffer because of our faith. And what I would say about persecution, the suffering in the flesh, we're called to it. Persecution is a real thing. Now, there are different levels of persecution. Maybe it's persecution, like someone wouldn't sit with me at lunch because they think I'm a Christian. Okay, there is some level of persecution. There are way higher levels of persecution in the world. So I tend not to want to gravitate towards those little ones. But they are real. What I would say about persecution is this. We don't have to look for it. We don't have to try and find it. We don't have to be like, hey, look, I'm supposed to suffer like Christ, so I'm going to go find persecution. I'm going to see if that can happen. It will come to you naturally. Don't worry about that. Okay? But also, so don't look for it, but also don't run away from it either. Just know that if you are living the Christian life, that there are going to be times in your life that it's going to happen. Again, it may not be strong, it may not be severe, but it's going to happen. So don't look for it, but don't run away from it either. That's part of how I think we are called to suffer in the flesh. But the other part comes from self-denial. Self-denial. Not pursuing every latest and greatest thing that is out there. We need to build up an immunity, if we haven't already, to all the advertising that we're bombarded with constantly. Not pursuing, I don't need the latest version of anything that comes out. I don't need the flashiest, newest concept of something. I need to deny myself. I'm living ultimately for Jesus. I'm not living for myself. So we're called to have the same purpose, the same mind of Christ who suffered in the flesh. I think we'll see that through persecution. I think we'll see that through self-denial. Now, what are the results of that? If we see persecution, we see self-denial, what are the results? The results are pretty awesome. It says in verse 1 that you will cease from sin. Since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Now, what does that mean? I'm going to give you two kind of negative sides of that and a positive side. Negative means it's things that aren't there, and a positive something that is there. So first of all, we cease from sin. It means we're not living in the flesh anymore. That past reality is just that. It's a past reality. It's not a present reality. And I would say, first of all, when we are persecuted from others, when we receive persecution, that it actually causes us to stand our ground even stronger. Now again, I don't have a great personal example of immense persecution. But I did have, in high school, I had a English teacher, and I became a Christian in 8th grade. This was my 9th grade teacher. And he grew up in a Catholic school, and he did not like the Catholics. And therefore he did not like Christians because they were hard on him. For probably a good reason. He probably needed it. So if you're listening, Mr. Lakey, I love you. Someday he'll look up this online, he'll find it. So anyway, but he would kind of harass me a little bit about my faith because I was a newfound Christian. I wasn't overly outspoken, but I wasn't secret about it. And so he would kind of give me a hard time. But the reality is that actually helped solidify my faith because it gave me opportunities in that classroom to share my faith that I wouldn't have had otherwise. He actually was opening the door for me in his making fun of me. And sometimes actually people kind of rallied to my side because they saw that this teacher was kind of giving me a hard time. It just strengthened me when I had persecution. Now again, that's a very small version of it. But this is the reality. When we cease from sin, we don't live in the flesh. When we experience persecution, it actually makes us stronger. And then the second part of that is that we no longer live for the lusts of men. And this ties more to that self-denial piece. See, when we grow in a disciplined life, when we learn to deny ourselves, we are building up this immunity towards the enemy's tactics and temptations. So when I say building up an immunity, it's not just advertising, although I think that's a big part of it. But it's just anything that the enemy might throw our way. The things that he's going to tempt us with and the tactics he's going to use, we start to not even be interested in them anymore. Because we've learned to deny our own desires, our own lusts, our own things we want. We've learned that to follow our own heart is not the best course of action. To actually follow the heart of God is the best course of action. And he will so many times give us way more than what our own heart would have wanted. This is the second, if you will, the negative. We're no longer living for the lusts of men. We're no longer living in the flesh. But then we get to the positive, which is that we're living for the will of God. In all of this, we're seeking what God wants for our life more than what we want. We're seeking his will, not my will. Verse 2, I think, says it beautifully. We no longer... live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lust of men, but for the will of God. And I can't help but think of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. The last night He was on earth before he got arrested, actually the night he got arrested, and he was praying in the garden. He went off by himself and he prayed. And he said, God, Abba, Father, I don't want to do this. This is not my plan. This is not fun for me. I'm not looking forward to the cross and saying, I can't wait to save all these people. This is going to be great. He's not looking forward to saying, well, I know I'm going to rise again anyway. It's not a big deal. He's saying, I don't want to do this. This is literally going to be hell. And then he said, probably the best words that you and I ever could have heard from the lips of Jesus. Not my will, but yours. I submit myself to what you want. It just struck me preparing for this morning that Jesus didn't want to come to earth. He didn't want to be born in a baby and take on human flesh. He didn't want to go to the cross and die a horrendous death. But he said, okay, it's not about what I want. It's about what is best, and literally for humanity. It's about doing something that was pleasing to my Father. Like trusting my Father knows what he's doing, even though I don't want to do it. This is the Son of God himself who had these feelings. So we can ask, we can say, Lord, Jesus, what is it that you want? Not what I want. And I think the verse, probably many of you have this memorized, that encapsulates this really well, is Galatians 2:20. Paul is writing to the Galatian church, and he's reminding them of this truth. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. Crucified, dead, hung on the cross. I've been crucified with Christ. When Christ was crucified, when I accept Christ as my Lord and Savior, that's what it means, is that I am putting myself up on the cross too. I'm crucified with him. And because of that, I no longer live. I'm not alive anymore. I don't have any desires to fulfill. I'm gone. It's not me. But Christ lives in me. Because Christ wasn't just crucified. He also rose from the dead. And so the life I live is no longer mine. Christ lives in me. The life I live now in the flesh, even though I'm still in this fleshly, earthly body, I don't live by my desires. I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. This is the reality that we are to live in. Not the past reality, but the present command. Arming ourselves with the same mind, the same attitude, the same purpose of Christ. Being willing to suffer, whether it's through persecution or self-denial, so that we can live for Christ and not for ourselves. So this morning, we have the privilege of remembering the death of Christ. We drew this through a tradition that really Christ handed down to us from the very beginning, from that same night. The night he was in Gethsemane and he surrendered his will to God. That same night before he was having supper with his disciples. And he had some bread and he broke it and he said, this is my body. Now this is before he died. This is before the Gethsemane. But he said, he knew where he was headed. The disciples were a little clueless. But he said, this is my body and it's broken for you. And when it's broken, it's as a sign of love for you. But that's what he's calling us to. That's this Galatians passage. He's calling us to have our bodies broken. I pray not literally, but it may come to that. But to be broken and die so that we can receive his life. This is what he's called us to. This is what we're remembering this morning. And then he also took the cup and he said, this is a cup of new covenant. It's my blood poured out for you. Again, this was before he died. They didn't exactly get this. It took a while for them to get it. But we get to remember this. My prayer for us this morning is that we will remember our death, our crucifixion in the life of Christ, so that we can live for him. As Peter says, that we can live for the will of God, not for the desires of man.